Chapter 6 of Kill All Normies is about the Manosphere, if such a thing can be said to exist. Now, I don't consider myself to be a men's human rights activist, more of a fellow traveller. I'm an egalitarian, and the swing against men in Western nations should make anyone who considers themselves to be in favour of equality, and consistently so, to be a men's rights activist. Still, I share a lot of their concerns, a lot of their frustrations. I'm just wary that aspects of the MHRA movement are becoming a mirror image of the things that are wrong with feminism. I don't like the way in which A Voice for Men goes about things, though I think it had its place perhaps in the past to draw attention, and I would rather not have cranks like Philip Davies or Mike Buchanan as figureheads. But beggars can't really be choosers. Still, I share the frustration that a lot of MHRAs have with being constantly misrepresented in the media. And Nagle is particularly frustrating in this chapter. She does what seems to have become the fashion at the moment in acknowledging that there are genuine men's issues and listing some of them, and that the Manosphere as a description is pointlessly broad. But then she goes on to conflate everything together anyway. You know, when you describe men's human rights activists, men going their own way, and pickup artists all in the same breath, you might as well be lumping lesbian separatists and the Women's Institute together. It makes no sense at all to do this. Political lesbianism has nothing to do with fruitcake. It just doesn't work. So the Manosphere doesn't really exist any more than the Womanosphere does. And again, she doesn't seem to know that well what she's talking about in this chapter. The men's movement would not, for example, be horrified to learn that it grew out of feminism. Soft-spoken Warren Farrell remains important for MHRAs, and his history, starting with feminism, is well known. Like many women today, MHRAs are distancing themselves from feminism and even turning against it, not because they hate women or don't embrace equality and fairness and so on, but because they love women and they do embrace equality, fairness and so on. What they don't embrace is a reversal of assumed historical oppression and the way feminism has gone about things, the way that it attacks men and makes them into the villain. Nor is it accurate, I think, to describe the MHRA movement as traditionalist. Some want that, some don't. You could call it choice masculinism, as there is choice feminism that many modern feminists scoff at. You know, the key aspect being having the choice, not necessarily what you do with it. MHRAs even come under fire from traditionalists and alpha men for wanting to acknowledge that men can be victims, and that they want to open up that caregiver role to the men that want it. Some men want a traditional role just as some women want a traditional role. Both those sets of people are being denied that traditionalist choice by society. But while new roles for women have been established, new ways of being in society, new socially acceptable ways of being, that same thing hasn't happened for men. There's still a lot of pressure to be traditional, but no capacity to be traditional. So new roles and ways of being for men just haven't been explored, haven't been accepted, haven't been made. The same kind of societal shift and effort hasn't been focused upon men. Anti-feminism in these circles should not be read as anti-equality, but rather as part of the same backlash talked about in previous chapters against an authoritarian and hypocritical hyper-PC culture and elite that's constantly attacking, in this case, men. I think in that context, in that situation, anger is understandable, but that's another problem for men. Female anger is seen as legitimate and something that needs addressing. You know, something must be done to stop these women being so angry. whereas male anger is seen primarily as dangerous and something to be quashed, controlled, stamped out and policed. Men do not have a safe way to express their anger. It's a mistake again to characterise men's rights movements as right-wing, though again we see people pushed to the right by the tactically suicidal rejection of them by the left. Egalitarianism and easing people's suffering are supposed to be left-wing values. Taking care of the still primarily male working class is supposed to be a left-wing value. When men stand up and demand equal consideration and rights, the left should be the ones responding to this, and yet not. The book uses the term red pilling to draw a tenuous link between the men's movements and the far right, since both use that same terminology for the Matrix, but then so do a ton of other groups. It's just a turn of phrase now, a metaphor that many people use for becoming aware of something you weren't aware of before, something life-changing. It doesn't create a link between men's groups and the far right any more than the sarcastic use of the term woke by the skeptic community makes them social justice warriors. Are there genuinely misogynistic groups and individuals out there? Sure, there's all kinds of horrible people online. But it's dishonest to group them together like this, or to tar them with the same brush, unless it's the definitive culture of the group. Feminism does have that problem. Every talking head, every feminist journalist or writer, every feminist commentator or social media crusader seems to be a horrible misandrist and scientifically illiterate. They define feminism for people in a way that misogynist extremists don't for men's groups. But the media tries to portray it as though they do, and presents them inaccurately. But then if they presented them accurately, more people might agree with them, as we're seeing with the response to the Red Pill movie. Mixing pickup artist culture into all this is especially egregious. Nagle again acknowledges the antipathy between pickup artists and men's rights activists, so why bring them up at all? Why take satirical pieces by Roosh V from the pickup artist community and Paul Elam from the MHRA community seriously? Why cite BuzzFeed as a source for anything, let alone a profile of Elam? As I've said, I don't much care for a voice for men's style, and that's a big part of why I would not consider myself to be a men's rights activist, but the sarcasm in his articles and in the titles of their pieces is painfully obvious. And often the very things that people are shocked at that when they read them on A Voice for Men are simply mirror images of feminist lines, articles, quotes, or talking points. Bringing up registerher.com, which as far as I'm aware isn't a genuine site, but it's supposed to be a site that warns men off bad women, so you can look up bad exes and so on this site. That was a response to a similar thing doing the rounds about men that's since faded into obscurity. So why bring that up? Because it's just, again, the mirror image. You know, this double standard is obvious. One need only look back to Gamergate to see the double standards operating around Erin Cagioni's warning about his abusive ex Zoe Quinn. Were the genders reversed and it was a woman warning about an abusive ex, I doubt there would have been anything like the response that there was. You know, you can cherry pick extremists and quote mine galore in the Manosphere, as We Hunted the Mammoth does, and you can misrepresent, as We Hunted the Mammoth does. But one can easily do the same with feminist writings and figureheads. I don't think that's a decent way to argue, and nor do I think feminism would come out particularly well in that battle. Whatever you think of all this, men are in crisis on various levels, and the absence of a workable new male identity is a problem. Women have indeed reinvented themselves successfully, but no real attention has been paid to men's reinvention, and attempts to do so seem to fail, mostly because they don't meet with female approval. Men have been more than willing to accommodate women's changes because they love women and they want them to be happy, but this only seems to flow really in one direction, at least societally. Not many women want a dependent man who will stay home and look after the kids. Some do, more power to them, but it's not an acceptable male role. The majority of men look down on it, the majority of women don't want it. so it's not viable so long as that's the case. Many women still want men to be providers, but society and work is no longer geared to allow that to happen, save for the kind of top tier of men. We can't seem to admit that men have issues, we can't seem to let men work it out for themselves, and we can't seem to allow ourselves to help men as a society. It's horrifying, really. Elliot Rodger is mentioned in this chapter, and he was a frustrated, desperate young man who ended up murdering a bunch of people, mostly men, ironically, not that you'd know it from the reports at the time. If you haven't read his sprawling, insane manifesto, I'd suggest that you do for some insights into him. You know, when things like this happen, you can get some value from trying to understand what happened and why, and the best place to do that is to go to the source. So I do suggest reading it. Not taking it seriously, but just reading it and trying to understand how he got to that space that he was in. He was not, however, really associated with any aspect of this manosphere that doesn't really exist, save a few posts on an anti-pickup artist forum. People nonetheless attempted to pin his actions and his violence on men's rights activism. I resisted that live on Al Jazeera, which was a weird experience. But still, this simply wasn't true, and that's what I was there to point out. You know, there's a narrative here at work attacking men again at the very time they need the most help and the most sympathy, and again they're being blamed and made into monsters. And societies with a large number of rootless, feckless young men without hope or purpose, societies like that tend to be unstable. Perhaps for all our sakes, it's time we started taking men's issues seriously. As to this chapter as a whole, I think it tries to tackle too much at once. I think it should have concentrated on the one meaningful part of the manosphere, which is the men's human rights activists, the real issues that they try to address, the way they've been treated by the media and society, and the resentment that that has created, because that's the aspect that relates to this whole countercultural narrative that Nagle is trying to describe. But she doesn't do such a good job. At least not in this chapter.